The snow fell quietly over Poland that winter night in 1939, a silence that seemed to swallow the world before the guns began. Villages slept beneath a pale moon while, far to the west, engines already growled across the German frontier. Inside the small border town of WWII, families woke to the thunder of bombs before dawn, the first cries of a war that would engulf continents. Within hours, the skies turned black, the earth trembled, and history itself shifted course. What began as one invasion would soon become humanity's darkest descent and its most enduring lesson. Chapter 1: The World Before the Storm. In the years before the Second World War, the world carried the uneasy rhythm of recovery. The scars of the Great War still marked the streets of Europe. Empty chairs at dinner tables, faded medals in drawers, and a silence that hung over veterans who had seen too much. Nations rebuilt, but trust was fragile. Across the continent, economies stumbled between promise and ruin, and the hum of factories echoed with both progress and fear. In Germany, the air crackled with something dangerous. Pride reborn as desperation. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation humiliated, stripped of its army and dignity. Into that vacuum stepped a man with piercing eyes and a voice that seemed to promise everything: Adolf Hitler. To millions of unemployed citizens, he offered certainty. To those disillusioned by democracy, he offered order. And in the crowded beer halls of Munich, his words spread like wildfire. One people, one nation, one leader. Few understood then how heavy that promise would become. Britain and France, still haunted by the trenches, wanted peace above all. Their leaders believed diplomacy could tame ambition, that paper agreements might stop steel divisions. The League of Nations met, debated, condemned, but rarely acted. The world had lost its appetite for war. It would pay dearly for that hunger for peace. Meanwhile, in the East, Joseph Stalin reshaped the Soviet Union with brutal precision. The purges, the gulags, the fear, all hidden behind speeches of progress. His vision was one of control, not freedom. While Europe watched Germany, Stalin watched Europe, calculating when opportunity might come. And across the Atlantic, America turned inward. The Great Depression had left the nation weary and cautious. Isolation felt safe. The oceans seemed to promise distance from Europe's endless conflicts. Yet deep within the State Department, quiet reports whispered of German rearmament, of Japanese aggression, of something inevitable drawing near. In Tokyo, that inevitability was already taking shape. Japan's empire stretched across Asia, fueled by expansion and resource hunger. Manchuria had fallen years before, and China now burned beneath the rising sun. To Japanese generals, the West's hesitation was weakness, a chance to seize what destiny demanded. For ordinary people, life went on. Children played in the streets of Paris. London's buses rattled through fog and rain. Farmers in Poland ploughed frozen soil, their radios humming with distant voices they did not yet fear. In Berlin, mothers lined up for bread, unaware their sons would soon wear grey uniforms and march east. But there were signs, subtle then obvious. Factories once silent now roared through the night. Rail lines expanded toward the borders. Propaganda posters bloomed like weeds across cities. Smiling workers, proud soldiers, slogans of destiny. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. By 1938, the world's map began to change. Austria was swallowed first, the Anschluss, greeted by cheering crowds and trembling diplomats. Then came the Sudetenland, carved from Czechoslovakia under the guise of protection. Chamberlain returned from Munich with a piece of paper and a phrase that would echo in regret. Peace for our time. But peace was already dying. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted like shadows. Stalin's diplomats met with Berlin's in secret, their talks hidden under coded cables and false names. Out of those whispers would come a pact that stunned the world, an agreement between two enemies, drawn not by ideology, but by calculation. By the summer of 1939, Europe stood at the edge. The Wehrmacht mobilized along the Polish border. Trains full of troops vanished into the forests. And in Warsaw, soldiers watched the horizon, hearing rumors of a German buildup that seemed too massive to be bluff. They had no illusions. Poland was small, brave, but alone. The last days of peace carried an eerie calm. Newspapers speculated. Markets fluctuated. Diplomats wired desperate messages across the continent. Yet the machinery of war was already turning. In Berlin, generals finalized invasion plans under the codename Fall Weiss. In Moscow, Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, dividing Poland on paper before a single shot was fired. Then came August 31st. A quiet evening, a staged attack at a German radio station near the border, a false flag crafted to justify what was coming. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the world broke again. The first bombs fell on Wheeling at 4:40 a.m. No warning, no declaration. The Luftwaffe turned a sleeping town into rubble in less than 20 minutes. Witnesses recalled the sound, a deep mechanical scream from above, followed by silence so complete it felt unreal. Civilians ran through smoke and fire, searching for children, for anyone alive. They were the first casualties of a war that would soon reach every corner of the earth. And in that moment, under a grey Polish sky, the illusion of peace vanished forever. Chapter 2: Descent into War. The first days of September 1939 felt unreal. Across Europe, people gathered around radios, straining to hear the trembling voices of leaders announcing what so many had feared. Britain and France declared war on Germany, their words solemn but their armies still unready. The echoes of those broadcasts spread through quiet living rooms, over factory floors, and into schoolyards where children were too young to understand the weight of what had begun. In Berlin, Hitler appeared triumphant. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, tanks slicing through Polish defenses, Stukas diving in precision strikes that shattered cities and morale alike. The strategy, blitzkrieg, lightning war, was unlike anything the world had seen. Fast, ruthless, coordinated. The sky, the ground, and the radio all spoke one language: domination. German officers recorded it in cold efficiency, describing miles conquered, bridges taken, prisoners captured. But beneath the reports were the unspoken truths: the massacres, the executions, the civilians caught in the path of modern war. In Warsaw, the bombs never stopped. Buildings collapsed like paper. Hospitals overflowed. Journalists wrote of fire raining from the heavens, of mothers shielding children as sirens wailed. The Polish army fought bravely, but its cavalry and rifles could not withstand steel and fire. The world watched, horrified but motionless. France's troops remained behind the Maginot Line, a fortress built for the last war, not the one that had begun. Britain prepared, but waited, and the Soviet Union waited too until September 17th, when its forces poured into Poland from the east. The pact had been kept. From the ashes of Poland, new horrors emerged. The SS followed the army, not to fight, but to cleanse. Villages were emptied, synagogues burned, records erased. These were not acts of battle, but ideology made flesh. The Nazi vision of racial purity took its first full step in occupied lands. Ordinary citizens were registered, categorized, and vanished. It was only the beginning. By the spring of 1940, the war spread like a storm rolling west. Denmark and Norway fell in days, their coastlines seized for control of the North Sea. France braced behind its line of concrete and hope, but Hitler's generals moved faster than strategy could adapt. On May 10th, German armor rolled through the Ardennes, terrain the Allies believed impassable. Within weeks, Paris was under threat. In London, Winston Churchill had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. His first speech to Parliament captured the grim truth. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." His voice, gravel and resolve, reached across the Atlantic and into hearts that understood the gravity of his words. Britain stood alone, facing a continent under the swastika. When France fell, it fell hard. German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe as Parisians watched in disbelief. Some wept, others hid. The French government fractured. Half fled to Britain, half surrendered in Vichy. For the German war machine, it was a victory of mythic proportions. For the people of Europe, it was the death of safety. But Hitler's ambition was not satisfied. The Luftwaffe turned its eyes across the Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, began with the skies. Bombs rained over London, Coventry, Birmingham. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, the city burned while citizens huddled underground in stations and tunnels, listening to the heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. Above them, young pilots, barely men, fought in hurricanes and Spitfires, turning the tide one dogfight at a time. Churchill called them the few, and he meant it. Each night's survival felt like a miracle of will. Across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt faced his own storm. America was still neutral, but neutrality was becoming impossible. Merchant ships carried aid across dangerous waters, dodging U-boats that hunted beneath the waves. The arsenal of democracy, Roosevelt declared. Factories roared to life again. Tanks, planes, munitions, all bound for Britain. The gears of global war had begun to grind in full. Meanwhile, in the east, Stalin's gaze turned toward Finland, then the Baltics. The Soviet Union expanded its borders with cold precision, carving its sphere of influence while Europe burned. Yet Hitler watched the Red Giant with suspicion. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had bought him time, but not trust. In secret, German command began drawing plans under a new codename, Operation Barbarossa. And far from Europe, Japan's empire tightened its grip on Asia. The invasion of China deepened, cities razed, populations enslaved. The brutality there was as relentless as any in Europe. Yet the world remained distracted by Hitler's rise. In Tokyo's war rooms, strategists whispered about oil, resources, and an inevitable clash with the West. The road to Pearl Harbor was already being paved. For millions, the war became daily life. Blackouts at night, ration cards by day, families torn apart by conscription. Letters from the front arrived with trembling hands, or didn't arrive at all. The world's map changed faster than anyone could process. Each border redrawn by fire and fear, and through it all, propaganda filled the airwaves. Each side claimed destiny, each claimed righteousness. Yet beneath the slogans, people knew what they were losing. Europe's culture, its cities, its humanity, all being consumed by the machinery of ideology and steel. Diplomats no longer spoke of peace, only of endurance. Leaders no longer promised victory, only survival. The descent into war was complete, and in that descent, the world would find both its worst darkness and its most fragile hope. Chapter 3: Fire and Iron. By June of 1941, the illusion of alliance between Berlin and Moscow shattered like glass under the weight of ambition. Before dawn on June 22nd, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border under a single codename, Operation Barbarossa. The largest invasion in human history had begun. Tanks roared across the plains of Ukraine, aircraft screamed over Belarus, and entire Soviet divisions vanished beneath the relentless pace of blitzkrieg. To Hitler, it was destiny. To those on the ground, it was hell. The summer heat rose from the earth in shimmering waves as columns of German armor rolled eastward. Dust caked on uniforms, engines overheated, but the advance never slowed. Villages fell, one after another, their defenders unprepared, often without orders or ammunition. Soviet soldiers, some still carrying rifles from the First World War, fought with desperation, but the Wehrmacht's coordination was overwhelming. In the first weeks alone, hundreds of thousands were encircled, trapped in pockets at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Stalin, paralyzed by disbelief, refused to believe reports of disaster. He had trusted the pact with Hitler. That trust was now bleeding out across the steppes. From the air, the devastation was absolute. Luftwaffe squadrons owned the sky, bombing rail lines, convoys, entire cities into rubble. Witnesses in Minsk recalled the horizon glowing red for days. The smell of oil, earth, and burning flesh hung heavy. Civilians fled on foot, pushing carts, carrying children, looking over their shoulders at the smoke columns that marked their homes. For many, the front was not a line. It was everywhere. But the deeper the Germans advanced, the more the land turned against them. Roads vanished into mud. The Russian summer gave way to autumn rains, and every mile forward became a struggle against terrain and time. The Soviets, though battered, began to adapt. They burned crops, flooded fields, destroyed bridges, anything to slow the invaders. The scorched earth was both a strategy and a statement. Nothing for the enemy, no matter the cost. Then came winter. By November, the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Moscow. The soldiers could see the distant glow of the capital, but they were exhausted, starving, and ill-equipped for the cold. Boots cracked in the frost, engines froze, rifles jammed. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. German divisions that had raced across Europe now fought just to stay alive. The myth of invincibility began to crumble beneath the weight of frostbite and Soviet resistance. In those same frozen fields, new legends were born. Soviet troops in white camouflage struck from the forests, supported by T-34 tanks that seemed unstoppable in the snow. Reinforcements arrived from Siberia, hardened, silent, relentless. They counterattacked at dawn on December 5th. The sound of artillery rolled across the plains like thunder. German lines buckled and the Red Army pushed them back step by bloody step. Hitler had promised his men they would never retreat. Now, many froze where they stood, unwilling or unable to move. While the Eastern Front consumed millions, another battle raged far to the west. In the skies over Britain and the seas of the Atlantic, convoys carrying food and arms from America faced the unseen terror of U-boats. Submarines stalked them in wolf packs, striking in darkness, leaving survivors clinging to wreckage in icy water. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought for glory, but survival. Each ship that reached port meant another week of endurance for Britain, and then, across the Pacific, a second shock. On December 7, 1941, the calm of a Sunday morning in Hawaii shattered as Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted barely 2 hours, but its impact reshaped the world. Battleships burned, smoke rose over the harbor, and more than 2,000 Americans lay dead. The next day, Roosevelt's voice filled the airwaves, calm, measured, resolute. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. America was now at war. From that moment, the conflict was truly global. In North Africa, British and German forces clashed in the vast deserts. Rommel's Afrika Korps against Montgomery's 8th Army. In the Pacific, islands became battlegrounds where every inch of sand was paid for in blood. The war stretched across time zones, continents, and oceans. There was no place untouched. Yet through the chaos, small acts of humanity persisted. A Soviet nurse writing letters home for dying soldiers. A British pilot sharing a cigarette with his mechanic before another mission. An American sailor pulling strangers from burning water. These moments did not change the tide of war, but they reminded those who survived why they fought at all. By 1942, the scale of the slaughter defied comprehension. At Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River became the focal point of annihilation. German troops fought building to building, room to room, while Soviet defenders refused to yield a single street. Not one step back, Stalin ordered. Snipers watched from shattered windows. Civilians dug trenches with bare hands. Entire divisions were swallowed by the ruins. The winter wind carried the sound of screams, artillery, and the endless echo of boots in rubble. When it ended months later, Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a graveyard. The German 6th Army ceased to exist. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway turned the tide against Japan. American pilots, outnumbered and undertrained, found and destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The balance of power shifted, but the cost remained immense. Both sides now understood the war would not end quickly. It would be fought to exhaustion. By the close of 1942, the world was engulfed entirely. Soldiers in every hemisphere looked up at the same grey sky, unsure whether they would see another sunrise. The war of fire and iron had consumed them all, and though victory lay somewhere far beyond the horizon, so did a darkness none of them yet imagined. Chapter 4: Shadows and Ashes. By 1943, the tide had begun to turn, but the cost was almost beyond bearing. Europe was scarred. Cities that once glowed with life now stood as skeletons of stone. From Warsaw to Rotterdam, from Stalingrad to Naples, whole neighborhoods had vanished beneath fire and rubble. Every window seemed to tell a story of loss. The war was still raging, yet survivors had already begun to wonder what kind of world would remain when it ended. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army pushed westward with merciless determination. Stalingrad had broken the illusion of German supremacy, and now the counter-offensive rolled forward. Kursk, Smolensk, Kiev. The battles were vast, mechanical, and bloody beyond comprehension. Thousands of tanks clashed on open plains, metal grinding against metal under skies thick with smoke. German soldiers, once conquerors, became defenders of ground that froze, melted, and bled beneath them. The retreat began, slow and relentless, shadowed by the knowledge that defeat no longer meant surrender. It meant retribution. In the West, the Allies prepared their return to Europe. North Africa had fallen, then Sicily. Italy's fascist regime collapsed under bombardment, and Mussolini's statues were dragged down by the same crowds that once saluted him. Yet the fighting did not stop. The mountains of Italy became a graveyard of empires, Allied troops advancing inch by inch, every hill paid for in blood. For the soldiers, it was a world of mud, artillery, and rain, where the line between victory and survival blurred into exhaustion. Back in Britain, The air was alive again with the rumble of bombers, but now they flew east. Lancaster and B-17 crews filled the night sky, carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden. Firestorms consumed entire cities, their heat so intense it melted asphalt and glass. The civilians below were no longer symbols of the enemy. They were simply people, trapped in the machinery of total war. The moral lines had blurred beyond recognition. In war, vengeance always finds its own logic, and yet, amid the fire, humanity endured. In occupied fronts, the resistance grew bolder. Trains derailed, cables were cut. German officers disappeared without trace. In the forests of Yugoslavia and Poland, partisans fought on, their weapons scarce but their conviction unbroken. Small victories carried the weight of defiance. Every act of sabotage, every smuggled message, was a whisper that said the occupiers would not last forever. But in the east, behind the front lines, the true horror unfolded. As Allied soldiers advanced, they began to uncover the reality of the Nazi system. Camps hidden in forests, behind electrified fences, guarded by men who claimed to follow orders. The names would become eternal wounds: Treblinka, Sobibor, Auschwitz. At first, few believed the reports. The scale of it seemed impossible. Yet as the gates were opened, as the living stumbled out, and the dead lay in mountains around them, disbelief turned to silence. The Holocaust was not rumor. It was truth carved into ash. In 1944, the Allies crossed the Channel. Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6th, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Before dawn, the sea was filled with ships, the sky with aircraft, and the hearts of 156,000 men with fear and resolve. The beaches of Normandy erupted in chaos. Machine guns tore through waves of soldiers. Sand turned red. Yet hour by hour, the beachheads held. By nightfall, Europe had a foothold in freedom again. From that moment, Germany's fate was sealed. Allied armies pushed from the west, Soviet divisions from the east. Hitler retreated into the bunker beneath Berlin, his empire collapsing above him. The propaganda that once promised glory now spoke only of sacrifice. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was a ruin. Artillery thundered day and night. The Red Army advanced street by street, while the Allies liberated camps and cities one after another. When it finally ended, it did not feel like victory. Hitler was dead. Mussolini was executed. Japan still fought on, but Europe was finished. The war had consumed 50 million lives. Entire generations had vanished. Soldiers who returned home found towns unrecognizable, families gone, faces aged by loss. Even those who survived carried the war within them. In nightmares, in silence, in the empty spaces where friends should have been. In the Pacific, the final act came swiftly and brutally. The atomic bomb, a weapon born of secrecy and desperation, fell on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. In moments, cities vanished. Tens of thousands died instantly, their shadows burned into stone. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the first time. His words were calm, almost detached, yet they marked the end of an era of destruction. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He did not need to say more. When the guns finally fell silent, the world was both triumphant and hollow. The war had ended, but peace felt foreign. Soldiers walked home on shattered roads. Survivors of camps searched for names, for faces, for anything left of the lives they once knew. Cities began to rebuild, yet the air still smelled faintly of smoke. In the ruins of Berlin, a Soviet soldier wrote in his diary, "We won, but what did we lose to do it?" It was a question the whole world would ask for generations, and as the ashes cooled, new lines were already being drawn. Not of trenches or armies, but of ideology. The Cold War was waiting, quiet and patient, in the shadow of victory. Chapter 5: Echoes of the War. When the smoke finally lifted and the guns fell silent, the world stood at a crossroads, broken, humbled, but breathing. The Second World War had ended, yet its echoes carried through every city, every family, every heartbeat of the 20th century. From the rubble of Berlin to the ruins of Hiroshima, the question was no longer who had won, but what winning truly meant. In Europe, liberation had come at a staggering cost. The once great capitals, Warsaw, Berlin, London, Vienna, were scarred beyond recognition. Streets that had once held laughter were now filled with silence and ghosts. Millions were displaced, wandering across borders that no longer made sense. The The continent had become a graveyard of names and memories. Yet amid the rubble, people began to build again, brick by brick, hand by hand. Hope, fragile as it was, began to take root in the ashes. The victors gathered in rooms heavy with smoke and fatigue. In Yalta, in Potsdam, maps were redrawn, nations divided. Lines were drawn through countries with rulers and pens, not bullets. But those lines would shape the next half-century. Germany split in two. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. In the West, the United States emerged as both savior and superpower, its influence spreading across oceans. Stalin's gaze fixed on half of Europe. Churchill warned of an iron curtain descending across the continent. The old war had ended, but a new kind of conflict had begun. For ordinary people, the post-war years were filled with contradictions. The joy of survival mixed with grief too deep to measure. Soldiers returned home to find strangers where family had been. Women who had carried nations through war were told to return quietly to kitchens. Refugees who had fled the front lines found that peace did not always welcome them home. And in Germany, a nation now occupied, millions wrestled with the unbearable truth of what their country had done. The Nuremberg trials forced the world to confront evil in a courtroom. The images shown, the camps, the evidence, the survivors, became proof of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and endurance. In Japan, the emperor's divine image faded beneath the weight of surrender. Cities rebuilt under occupation, their streets lined with both memory and American influence. Children played among ruins that still whispered of firestorms. In Hiroshima, survivors, the hibakusha, bore scars that glowed faintly beneath the sun, living reminders of a weapon that changed history itself. For the first time, mankind had seen its own extinction in a single flash of light. Across the oceans, America transformed. Its industry, once dedicated to war, now powered prosperity. Suburbs spread. Highways grew. The GI Bill created new beginnings for millions. But beneath that optimism lingered unease, a sense that victory had come with a shadow. The atomic age promised peace through fear, progress through power. Science had given humanity the means to destroy itself, and no one could unlearn what they now knew. In the Soviet Union, triumph was celebrated with parades and medals, but grief was unspoken. More than 20 million dead. Soldiers, civilians, entire towns erased from the map. Stalin's regime rebuilt through control and silence. Eastern Europe became a mirror of that control. Nations liberated from one tyranny only to fall under another. Barbed wire and ideology replaced the front lines, and a new war, one fought in whispers, codes, and shadows, began before the last graves were filled. Still, life returned, as it always does. Children were born in the ruins. Schools reopened. Music drifted through cafes rebuilt from splintered beams. The generation that survived the war carried its memory quietly, in looks, in pauses, in the way they cherished small, ordinary joys. A warm meal, a quiet night, the absence of sirens. Historians would later call them the greatest generation, but for most, they were simply survivors. People who had seen the end of the world and chosen to begin again. Their legacy was not just victory, but endurance. Not just rebuilding cities, but rebuilding faith in one another. As the years passed, the war's images faded from newsreels into archives, then into history books. Yet its lessons remained etched into the conscience of humanity. The world learned, or hoped it had learned, that unchecked hatred, fear, and nationalism could burn civilization to the ground. The Holocaust forced nations to confront the cost of indifference. The atomic bomb reminded them how fragile existence had become. And yet, even as peace took hold, the echoes persisted. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the shadow games of the Cold War, the lessons of 1939 to 1945 were repeated, reinterpreted, sometimes ignored. Humanity moved forward, but never entirely escaped the war's long shadow. Today, when we walk through the quiet cemeteries of Normandy, the forests of Poland, or the preserved ruins of Hiroshima, we are reminded that history is not distant. It breathes beneath our feet. The stones, the soil, the silence. They remember. Each grave, each monument, each scar on the landscape tells a part of the story that can never be fully spoken. The Second World War ended 80 years ago, but its echoes of courage, cruelty, sacrifice, and hope still shape us. It reminds us what humanity is capable of, both in its darkest moments and its most resilient ones. And as the world faces new divisions, new uncertainties, the question remains the same one whispered in 1945. What will we remember, and what will we choose to forget?